Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the next edition of the Praxis webinar series. Today's webinar is of particular interest to anyone that might want technology in your museum project. My name is Chris Collins, Praxis member, and I'm the Managing Director of the Cultural Projects Practice Group at MGAC, a global boutique project management and owners representation firm with offices across North America and the UK. This afternoon, I'll be serving as your moderator for the webinar. And we can go to the next slide. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with Praxis, we are a museum professionals network whose members are seasoned professionals working at the top of our industry. We share ideas, best practices, new techniques, and new technologies. We're all practitioners working in many aspects of museum projects, from conception and master planning, content creation, lighting, media and communications, to construction and operations. With our combined network stretching across both the country and the industry, we provide a powerful resource to you as you contemplate the many aspects of your museum project. Our audience and clientele are museum leaders, exhibit designers, and architects, all people vested in creating thoughtful, engaging, state-of-the-art, and timely museum experiences. Today's webinar is in support of our mission to provide compelling information, open a dialogue with our community, and move forward together. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. Number one, the presentation will be about 30 minutes, followed by a question and answer period. I'll moderate that. Please mute your microphone for the duration of the webinar. Please also use the Zoom chat room feature to pose any questions that you'd like our presenters to address, and I'll do my best to get to them all. So with that, let's get started. Today, we bring you Tony Warner and Bryan Abelowitz from Phase Shift Consulting. Tony's the founder and president of Phase Shift Consulting, a technology design firm specializing in audiovisual, telecommunications, and security systems design in the built environment. Recognized as one of the top audiovisual solutions companies by CIO Review, Phase Shift leverages past performance on some of the most iconic projects around the world. A former president of Avixa and a recent board member of Integrated Systems Europe, Tony has played an active role in shaping strategic direction of the industry around the globe. Industry veteran Bryan Abelowitz carries over 3 decades of audiovisual design experience with a focus on building strong collaborative teams. As principal of Phase Shift, Bryan is passionate about delivering on an uncompromising commitment to client advocacy and project success. Whether corporate, education, or cultural, Bryan expertly guides project stakeholders towards an exceptional outcome, creating technology experiences that enhance the guest experience, not detract from it. He understands that it truly takes a village to raise a child, or in this case, a winning project. I'll hand it over to Tony.
Thank you, Chris, and good afternoon, everyone. So technology, why do we use technology in our projects? We use technology to engage, to entertain, to inform. But while there are many ways to engage with technology and many new trends, it's important that we also avoid using technology in ways that detract from our messages and interactions. So over the next half hour or so, we're going to take a look at a number of technologies and manufacturers. Our ultimate goal is to get you thinking about your projects and to get you excited about technology and its potential uses. We're going to take a look at visual and audio technology trends. We're then going to touch on some best practices for design of those technologies. And then lastly, we're going to pull all of that together and explore some practical applications for your projects. And during that process, we'll answer questions like, how big of a display do I need for this space? And what technology can I use that will blend into architecture? And what techniques can I use that will really engage my guest or visitor? So if we can advance, to get us started, we're going to dig into some current trends with visual technologies. So Bryan, why don't you take it away?
Sure. Thanks, Tony. Next slide, please, Paul. All right, we're going to start today's discussion with projection. We're going to start with projection, and we're going to talk a little bit about ultra short throw projectors. This is a relatively new class of projectors where we can put the projector very close to the image. So only a couple of feet from our image and create very large projected canvases that create images across wide areas, but with the projector being very close to the screen so that the guests and the visitors can get closer to the objects or to the walls as well. Some of the new projectors that we're working with allow the projector to be at the top of the screen, so you don't have to worry about offsetting over the top of the screen. Also, we have the ability to project at these very steep angles, and even the ability we're experimenting now with, we are putting projectors at the top of the screen and actually rotating those projectors so that the projector's at the top, but we're creating very steep portrait images, which is increasing the resolution or the number of pixels on the screen. Especially in immersive environments, we're finding ways to use projection to create many, many pixels on the screen in a very cost-effective manner. Next slide. Moving on from projection, we're also seeing a trend to use a lot more large displays. Displays that are easily 100-inch diagonal. Sony makes one, really LG makes one. Every major manufacturer makes a display now that is as big as makes an image as big as the projectors that we were using 5 years ago. And not only is this image very large and great for a theater, great for a presentation space, but they're also very bright, up to 940 nits. So we can put these in bright spaces. We can put these displays in lobbies. We can put these displays in classrooms with high ambient light, and really get the message across in a cost-effective package. Also, as far as installation, this 105-inch display from Sony is actually under 200 pounds. So it doesn't require a lot of wall blocking or a lot of advanced construction to get a display, a very large display on the wall. In fact, it is over the 5 years ago, Panasonic had a 108-inch plasma display, and that plasma display was actually 500 pounds. So now we have the same size image at less than half the weight. So it's a great technological advancement and definitely eases in installation. Next slide, please. Additionally, we're seeing a lot of use of display transparency. So we have displays now. For example, here's a display here, and that display is a 55-inch diagonal display, but you can see we can have image and content in the foreground and have the object in the background. And we can have those as a single image like you see here, or we can create video walls. So this is actually an array of transparent displays that is too tall and too wide to create a life-size canvas of information in front of an object. Or we can array these displays in a video wall layout and create, lines of transparent displays. And some of the new OLED technology is a very high resolution and high transparency, and it really allows you to create depth in your images. And one more, please. Beyond that, we're also seeing a lot of use of LED technology in curves and in unique shapes of LED. The LED manufacturers today have come so far in their ability to create custom shapes of displays and to create unique surfaces, and the resolutions are incredibly high as well. It really gives us the ability to realize the designer's goal and create shapes and sizes that really weren't possible 5 years ago. And with that, Tony, I'll turn it back over to you.
Sure. It's good stuff, Brian. I was realizing that it seems we so often tend to start with video when we're talking about AV, and I guess that's because video seems more immersive to us. But interestingly, however, research comparing audio and video has found that audio has a greater emotional impact for us. So found that interesting. So while maybe not as immersive, the audio side of our systems, they've also been evolving with some very interesting new technologies, such as micro form factor speakers and speakers powered with power over Ethernet. So Brian, why don't you walk us through some of the new techniques and trends that the audience might find interesting on the audio side?
Sure, Tony, thank you. Next slide, please, Paul. And that just an overview, current audiovisual technologies, as Tony mentioned, and we're going to take a look at real world uses and trying to keep the focus on museums here. Next slide, please. So this is kind of a unique shape, and this is known as the Anaconda speaker. So this is a 2-meter long speaker with 8 integrated drivers, and you can actually chain 32 of these devices together to create a speaker that is effectively 64 meters long. And you can see it here in a retail application as a piece of art and a speaker that will cover the entire area. But imagine being able to wrap this around a diorama or wrap it around an exhibit. We'll also wrap these speakers around columns to create an overall ambient sound in a gallery. Very flexible, very easy to hide. It's a great technique. It's a great speaker that allows us to really bring sound into the space. As Tony mentioned, sound is key, but allows us to integrate this into the physical environment. Next slide. Beyond that, we also have hidden speakers. We have speakers like you can see here, vertical speakers, horizontal speakers. The trend now is to have sound that just disappears into the architecture. So imagine turning this glass surface into a speaker and allowing sound to resonate from the glass surface, or speakers hidden in columns. We really have a lot of flexibility in where and how we place speakers that allow for adequate coverage and dynamic range for whatever the program content is that you want to deliver to your guest or to your visitor.
Bryan, I think it's worth pointing out, and we don't have a picture here, but some of these small form factor speakers that Bryan's talking about, they're literally like the size of a Hershey miniature bar, and made by the same company that makes that Anaconda speaker. But it gives us a lot of flexible options for integrating those speakers in places where you can barely even see them. And there's those speakers they don't tend to output a large volume level, but a lot of times in museum applications that isn't necessary, and we actually want to keep the volume level more controlled. So it gives us some really interesting options for solving problems that we didn't have a few years ago.
Absolutely, Tony. We really do need to add that picture. That Lizard speaker is smaller than a business card, and then it really has some good sound to it. Next, we're going to talk about audio networks. Next slide, please. So audio networks. So today, we are not deploying complicated audio systems with lots of wiring, lots of cables, lots of connectivity. Most of the audio that we do today is over a network. And that network starts with the source. And here it could be a computer, but it could be a media player, it could be any source. And that goes to a network switch. And from there, we go to an amplifier on the network. And from there, we feed the speakers in the gallery. So if you wanted to have the ability to do a presentation in the gallery, microphone back to the switch. And then the switch goes right back to the amplifier, or even directly to the speakers. We have speakers now that we can deploy that are PoE speakers. They don't need power. They don't need amplifiers. They take the power from the PoE network switch, and that's enough power to drive that speaker and create audio. And we can do whole galleries using simple network connections and a local amplifier to a whole array of speakers. It really does simplify the infrastructure planning that all of our most of our audio distribution today is actually over networks and category cable. Beyond that, we should start to talk about really what are the best practices for bringing technology to your environment. And for that, I'm going to hand it back over to Tony.
Sure. So that's certainly not a comprehensive list of new products and stuff. We tried to pick a few that we thought were the most interesting. And I should point out, none of the stuff that we just walked through is bleeding edge. It's all stuff that, we try to maintain an awareness of what is on the bleeding edge, but this stuff's all tried and true. It's current, and it's ready, and we feel that it's reliable for deployment right now. But so in addition to just the awareness of the new products, a successful AV system deployment needs to take into account quite a few other environmental factors. So for example, how do we know how large of a display we need? How important is the resolution? How many speakers do we need and where should they go? So to guide us with that, there are quite a few industry standards and industry best practices that help us work through those decisions. And while we don't want to get too technical and in the weeds here today, we thought it'd be helpful just to touch on some of the more important best practices that we use to show you kind of the I guess the logic that goes into choosing some of these products as we're working on systems.
Thanks, Tony. I'll pick it up from there. And I think what I'd like to do is take one specific use case that really resonates for anybody who's ever had to work or design a gallery. So Paul, if you can give me 2 slides forward, please. Okay, I know there's a lot of information on this chart. There's scales here, there's areas here, but let me go ahead and give you a great example. In a gallery for an exhibit, we want to decide how big to make the display. Oh, go back one, please. We want to decide how big to make the display. So we've targeted a 55-inch display. It works well in the layout of the elevation of the gallery. So a 55-inch display, the minimum viewing distance for your guest is about 5.5 feet. And the maximum viewing distance is 11.5 feet. So I always ask, where's the guest going to be when they view this display? That's probably the first point of decision-making for how big the display has to be. Besides, how does it lay out with all the objects and the artifacts, but how far is the viewer going to be versus the size of the display? Beyond the size of the display, the chart over here on the left illustrates relative different sizes. You can see how much bigger the 90 is to the 80, to the 60, 55. But what's also important is resolution. So I'll ask you, what resolution is the content going to be? What resolution is the display? Because that does make a difference. So if we take our same 55-inch display in the gallery and our content is 4K, so we're going to come into the 4K band here, and you'll see that really the midline of the viewing distance for a 4K image on a 55-inch display is about 6 feet. But if our viewer is actually 8 to 10 feet, or let's say 10 feet away from the display, they really don't get the benefit of 4K. So 4K images are only useful to your guest if they're close to the display. So again, that 55-inch display, the guest is 6 feet away. Absolutely, they're going to see the benefit of a 4K image on a 4K display. But if that same guest is 9 to 10 feet away, they really don't see the benefit of the ultra high resolution image. So it's the comparison of how big the display is versus how far the guest is versus what the content. And one other rule of thumb I will give you that I try to use is that for every viewer, I try to accommodate 10 to 12 inches of diagonal screen. So if the anticipated target for a display is a small group, 1 to 2 to 3 people, I might select a 32-inch display because, the 1 for 10 rule. But if you're telling me that if we're anticipating a family or a small group, 4 to 6 people, I'd probably select that magical 55-inch display because it really does cater, that's a good size to cater to that small group, that family experience, the breakout class huddled around a display. Next slide, please, Paul. Thank you. This chart also is helpful because I wanted to show the different relative size resolution. So you can see that a 1920 by 1080 display, HD display, we all know, we're all pretty familiar with HD, but this 4K display, this 3840 by 2160, is actually 4 of these HD displays. So here's one quadrant here, here's your second quadrant there, and then your third and fourth quadrants are here. Now, one thing I want to call to your attention that's important to show here is that 4K UHD, like we see in our game systems and video and programs, that's actually UHD, that's 3840 by 2160. But true 4K that you would see in a computer resolution is actually 4096 by 2180. So there actually is extra pixels on the edge in a 4K computer display as compared to a 4K video display. It's something to keep in mind for your content, for your displays, for your projection, that 4K actually has additional width on the right side of the screen. And next slide, please. Beyond that, as Tony mentioned, audio is extremely important. We're not just visual design, it is speaker coverage. And when we make decisions about speakers, we often use a nominal speaker coverage area of about 120 degrees of coverage. Or we fine tune that and say, well, actually the effective range for a speaker is about 90 degrees. So planning of speakers, we want to account for this coverage area and make sure that the sweet spot for the guest is, at the center point of the speaker range or within 45 degrees off axis. And beyond that, we also want to consider those speaker placements. Now, whether we have a presentation area where we're presenting to a group, we want to make sure that presenter does not fall within the coverage area of the speaker, so we avoid feedback. We typically move our speakers a little bit forward of our presenter so that our coverage areas go beyond. And when we have additional larger areas that we try to cover, we typically don't like to cover from the front and the back of the space. Now, this can be a classroom, but it also could be a theater, it could be a presentation space, really anywhere in the gallery. If we're creating program content, it's probably better to have the speakers lay out in tiers. So what we're showing here is that we cover the first half of the theater from the front of the room, then we carry the back half of the theater from the midline of the room, so that we don't get sound coming from behind you. It makes for a much better, a much more intelligible experience. With that, Tony, I'm going to hand it back to you. And next slide, please.
Sure. So now we look at some new products, and we've talked through a few of the best practices, really just a few of them, of how those products can be leveraged. We thought we'd kind of bring it all together and spend a little time putting those pieces together and exploring a few examples of some real life applications.
Great. So I picked just a couple of applications here to talk through, just to give you some ideas of what we're seeing in trends and technology to allow you to think about using this kind of technology in future deployments. So this is a LED mesh on a glass rail. We see these in many locations, from malls to commercial spaces, museums. We always have these glass rails. But what if we could make that glass rail digital, and we can make that engaging, and we can actually put content on the rail? This is actually a protected medium that goes sandwiched between glass and is a structural glass rail, but actually is digital and engaging. And messaging could be content. I mean, imagine, now showing kind of information, scheduling information on this railing. You really can get attention with it. Next slide. Beyond that, unique shapes and sizes. We have a manufacturer now that makes these custom round displays, high resolution, available touch or in a touch configuration, non-touch configuration. They're bright, they take standard HD images, and it really does give you a unique shape that you can use in your exhibits and in your exhibit planning. Next slide. Beyond that, we also have the ability to do wallpapers, signage. These are OLED, so these are very thin, not transparent, but thin and curvable displays that can be mounted and hung a lot like artwork, a lot like pictures, and really no depth at all. They can be blended and tiled to create larger images, but they create this kind of moving digital graphic that we just haven't seen before. Next slide. And we're not just 16:9 displays. Now we're seeing a lot more ultra stretch, ultra wide displays. So this is not just for Microsoft Teams. We can use this extra real estate, this extra aspect ratio in a variety of sizes, anywhere from really 34 inches up to 105-inch diagonal here, and give you a lot more real estate for your messaging, for your content, for your delivery. It really allows for a lot more flexibility in how much information you can put on the screen and where you can how it actually is displayed for the guest. Next slide. We also have the ability to provide for unified collaboration for a number of applications, cameras embedded in displays. So we can actually take a video camera and actually embed it directly into one of the LEDs in the module. You don't even see the camera. So now, instead of me having my video camera on a little mini tripod kind of hanging at the bottom of the screen, imagine being able to have the camera embedded in the display for communication and really get to that direct eye-to-eye communication. Next slide. And one last technology I wanted to call your attention to is this idea of a digital screen. So there's a manufacturer that makes these 46-inch displays. They're designed to be mounted into ceilings. They're plenum ready, and they're designed for 24-hour-a-day use. But imagine being able to turn your gallery, turning the ceiling of your gallery into a full digital environment using a standard tile wall layout. It really does make an amazing canvas and a new surface for presentation of your program, of your message. And with all these technologies, with everything that we do, it really does come to planning. Planning is key. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Tony.
Sure.
Next slide.
So I like this slide in that it's fun. We love geeking out on all of this AV technology, and that's where our passion is. But I think it's good. This slide reminds us all that all of the technology doesn't mean anything if it's not about the experience, and the experience is kind of what anchors everything together. So, but we did want to just underscore the importance of the experience is dependent on all of these other spokes around this wheel. So we thought we'd just leave you with a few things today to kind of get your thoughts going as far as maybe for current projects or future projects, just some things that really should be on your mind that, maybe we're not always thinking about. So we start with power. Is there going to be adequate power at your location where the technology is planned? And, one of the things that is often forgotten is surge protection. And, we're going to put all this thought into designing, these great AV systems, but if they're not protected from surges and things like that, we're maybe being short-sighted with that. Cabling infrastructure, that's another big one. What's it going to be, the cabling infrastructure? And should we be considering fiber, whether it's single mode or multi-mode? And we would say yes, we should be considering that. And it helps, hate to use the term future proofing, but it does, it helps us a lot to just kind of for unforeseen things that might come up in the future. So like single mode, very recommended for longer runs, and multi-mode for shorter runs. It has limited bandwidth, but oftentimes is cheaper as well. Then sources, we've talked a lot about like the displays. It's important though, what's our source? What's the content going to be? And do we need, Bryan touched on, do we need a 4K or a HD display based on the viewer? But if what's the content going to be? If we have 4K content, we don't want to just put an HD display out there that we won't be realizing most of the value of the content. So we need to be thinking through that from the earliest stages of the project as well. Are there any wireless requirements for the space would be another one when we look at our sources. Human interfaces, that's another big one. What's going to be the interface in this space? Do we need touch screens? Do we need support for bring your own device or scanning a QR code perhaps? And does there need to be voice control? Technologies and voice control have evolved a ton over the last few years too. So it gives us a lot of options again that a few years ago maybe weren't quite fleshed out. Sound. What's the nature of the sound? Does it need to be isolated to a specific area? We talked about that earlier with some of the little speakers as maybe being good tools for that. Another one, and Bryan touched on this when he was talking through the speaker layout, but understanding where's the imaging need to be. If it's just an ambient audio system, then it's fine having overhead speakers that we don't necessarily localize to anything. But if we have a specific video that we need to have audio associated with, then we probably want to localize those speakers to the image and maybe at a minimum have stereo sound. Oftentimes we're looking at, having a full surround or immersive sound as well. So again, we just need to understand kind of what the overall goal for that image is. Then we get into video again, and what's the nature of the video? So again, what size image is required? Bryan walked us through that. What type of video display is going to be most important? Do we want projection, LCD, LED, OLED, some hybrid mix perhaps? And all of those technologies are absolutely still valid today. They each just have their own application, and what makes sense in one situation doesn't maybe necessarily make sense in another. So we just need to think that through. And then lighting. What are the lighting conditions in the room, and is the lighting controllable? And the AV systems touch so many other ancillary aspects of the environment that acoustics. We need to be looking at all of those kind of things and seeing how they come together. And then finally, and this is a huge one that we oftentimes, this isn't involved in early conversations, but it's so crucial, is operation and maintenance requirements. And it's all well and good to deploy the latest and greatest AV systems and the latest technology that has a wow factor, but we need to understand what are the day two operational concerns or requirements for that. And does the current staff or the projected staff, are they going to be able to maintain that after all the contractors are out of the space? Are there ways that we can leverage the network to maybe allow these systems to be maintained and monitored remotely, perhaps from like one of your AV integrator partners? Also, even looking at things like laser projectors over lamps and looking at what are the impacts of that going to be on your maintenance staff long term? Again, an LED, OLED, significant reduction in operating costs over the total cost of ownership. So I think it's important that we have those conversations earlier rather than later during the design process. And just because we can do something doesn't always mean we should, because there are a lot of variables that come into play. So anyhow, just some food for thought. Hopefully that sparked some thoughts from all of you. And that brings us to the end of our presentation. Really do appreciate your time this afternoon. And we do have some time here and just for some Q&A, if anybody has any questions. I know a lot of people find AV topic fascinating and kind of want to know where technology is going. So if anybody has any questions, we'd be happy to take a few minutes and answer those right now.
We're waiting for the questions to roll in. Thank you very much for that presentation and ideas. Let's see if we can get some questions in. I have one while we're waiting for our visitors and guests here today. How do you keep technology planning in check to right size your main technology rooms? For planning technology racks and museum projects, have you guys ever combined the main data rack room with exhibit racks to be efficient with the use for cooling and electrical backup, UPS, things like that?
Sure, I can take that. So I think if the more that we can combine those spaces, the better. And you hit the nail on the head, Chris. It's we leverage then the benefits of the power requirements in the room, the grounding requirements, the cooling requirements, and that's big to not have to do that in multiple locations. So if we can do that, that would be our preference. One of the downsides of that is, and we don't see it as much in the museum sector as maybe some other sectors where we particularly look in the corporate space. A lot of times the IT department doesn't want the AV department having access to their servers and things like that. So either we need to have separate spaces, or sometimes we need to just segregate those rooms with a barrier. But again, I mean, if we can combine all that stuff and co-locate it, there are a lot of operational and design benefits to doing that.
Yeah, thank you. So second graders need to get along then, right? Different departments where they can, if it's all you know, a single nonprofit building museum. I've had that discussion before. It's like, wait a minute, you guys work for the same place.
Exactly.
Thank you so much. All right, we actually have some questions coming in here. Here's one: is projector technology going away?
Bryan, you want to take that?
Sure. The simple answer is no, absolutely not. Projectors continue to get more powerful. They continue to get smaller. Texas Instruments is working on higher resolution DLP chips for image production, for image replication, and the projector technology continues to grow and improve. The projector is still, using a projector is still the best way to get a large image at a relatively inexpensive price, and that's not going to change. We're always going to see projectors. They're always going to be useful, and their technology continues to improve.
You know, it's the answer to that's very dependent on the sector. You know, like in like corporate space, there's hardly any projection happening anymore. But if we go to the museum space, I would say the museum and themed entertainment industries are, I mean, that is where museum or the projection is still widely used, and I think is going to continue for the foreseeable future. There's just it can do things that direct view displays can't, and it has a lot of flexibility. So it's definitely here. And you know, we were just at our annual AV trade show Infocom a few weeks ago, and the manufacturers are 100% still supportive of projection and, you know, designing new projection technologies and things like that.
Cool. Here's another question. Could you talk a little about directional speakers, pros and cons related to some of these larger projection and AV displays?
I assume you're talking about like maybe steerable speakers with the question. Definitely, you know, those technologies again have improved dramatically over recent years as far as how we can steer line arrays and even small line arrays. And particularly again in the museum space, having that flexibility to help us control the sound into a very tightly defined area. Absolutely. I mean, it's probably more needed in this space than any other vertical that we work in.
Yeah, Tony, there's a number of speakers, mini line array type speakers, that really have a very small form factor. They might be 12 inches long and maybe a 2-inch by 2-inch, you know, rectangle, but they can do a pretty good job of controlling sound. And there's a number of manufacturers that make those kind of miniature linear arrays now. But really the best technique to localize sound is really to get the source of the sound as close to the visitor as possible. You know, so that we don't have to be loud, we don't have to be intrusive, but as the closer we can get, you know, we have a lot of miniature speakers that we can use these days.
Very good. Another question here. We would like to explore using transparent displays, but sizing seems limited. Are there any options? Any larger options, I should say.
I'll take that because I've been digging into some of the manufacturers on that, Chris. So currently the only viable size for a transparent display is a 55-inch diagonal display. That is not big enough to adequately represent the life-size image. So what you end up doing is you create this 2x2 array of OLED semi-transparent displays, and that creates an image that's about 110-inch diagonal, maybe 8 feet tall, 4.5 feet wide, and that's human, that's life size. The issue is you create a seam right across the middle and right down the middle. It almost looks like a target. So it doesn't work well for a lot of content. But I've been pushing the manufacturers that we need a bigger form factor OLED, and something in the order of 80 to 90-inch diagonal, something that we can use to create that kind of life-size portrait, but have the transparency as well. I get pushback, and the display manufacturers use terms like commercial viability. Can you use, will you buy 100,000 of them? Those kinds of things. But one of my goals is really to get us larger form factor, semi-transparent OLED displays.
And I think, Brian, one of the things because they're usually zero like bezels on the edges because they're clear up all the way to the edge. So we're working with LG on some projects right now, and they're pretty much the leader in that OLED transparent display. You can only mount 2 of their displays. You can tile them too high, but they don't allow you to go higher than that. And I believe you can do that in both portrait and landscape mode, but there are limitations with the mounting system when you get above that, as far as the rigidity of the overall structure. So there's things like that the manufacturers are still trying to work through and solve. I don't want to say we're at the very early stages of that technology, but we're definitely still in the evolving stages. So we try to keep an eye on that constantly and just kind of see how it's evolving. But it's definitely viable to use. We just have some limitations today still in kind of how to use that.
Very good. Another good question. How would you balance creating immersive spaces over best practices for display sizes? What are the factors, or is it limited to intent of the experience?
I would say intent and the why is always key. Yeah, I think understanding the designer's why do we need a display here, what the information is that's going to be displayed, that should dictate the selection of size. We shouldn't just pick a size because that's what fits or that's what the standards say. I think it's a give and take of all the stakeholders making the right decision that maximizes the guest experience.
Okay, and Celine Hong, if you have a follow-up question, please jump in there. Otherwise, hopefully that answers your question. Here's another question. What's the best way to create a holographic image? You see this more at the trade shows where we're like, ooh, make a hologram. And I get clients who are always asking about, we'd love to have a hologram. Like, well, get your checkbook out, right? Is it possible? And how do you keep it from eating your entire exhibit budget?
That's a really hard question. Tony, you want me to take that, or do you want
Sure.
Holograms are a loaded question in my book because they're based on Pepper's Ghost technology, which is semi-reflective mirrors and bouncing of images. And that's 100-year-old technology. That's nothing new. And I think Pepper's Ghost still creates the best holographic images, or what is a floating image. But that requires space, that requires light control. I've looked at a number of technologies recently that create images that are floating or maybe almost 3D. Things like Looking Glass Display has a couple of options that create some very cool images. Even I've seen some experimentation with using semi-transparent OLED displays and using a gap between 2 displays to create depth, to create the perception of something floating or of depth of an image. And there's a couple of other manufacturers that use lenticular technology and spatial technology to create these things that look like holographic images. But recently I went to the Disney 100 exhibition, Franklin Institute, and there's one of the very first images is Walt Disney, and he almost looks 3D. He almost looks holographic, but I think it really is just a flat screen with some excellent content, excellent it composed in such a way that there's depth to the image. So I think no matter what we use for technology, no matter how we dice the display, I think the content still is the key.
Very good. We're getting at the 45-minute mark here. Ask if anyone else has any other questions. And in the meantime, I wanted to thank everyone for coming today. If you have any ideas that we at Praxis could introduce into a webinar, please feel free to write us or send us a chat or reach out. And looking again to see if there are any more questions from the group today. Oh, can you talk about projection film?
Projection film. Projection film in the sense of a vinyl application to a surface to capture light. Sure, the one that always comes to mind is Vacuity by 3M, but there's a couple of manufacturers now, and I think there's some very good films out there. Really, the idea is to take what is a transparent surface and make it translucent. You know, when we're doing projection, we need something that captures the light instead of letting the light shine right through it. And those films do that for us. Now, there's also electrostatic glass as well that you can turn that translucency on and off, and that's another way to explore. If you want a glass surface that's normally transparent, but you need it opaque for projection at certain times, we can use that activated glass as well.
Can you project onto that though?
You actually, yes, you can project onto those I think they're electroluminescent glasses, yes.
Okay, yeah, we have a project that's proposed right now. It's interesting because it's proposed by the base building architect as a feature of the building, and we're trying to figure out what the exhibit design side to see how they would utilize that as part of the experience and make it all make sense together. It's interesting.
Yeah, the difference is it opaque, so we project from behind, or is it solid where we have to project from the front? And that depends on the level of transparency of the
right
film.
Sage glass is another way to I think that's one of the manufacturers.
Yes.
And my understanding is that's also that glass still does let some daylight through as well. So that's something to take into consideration when you're planning something like that.
In corporate environments, so they're used for privacy glass, right? Digital electronic privacy glass.
Okay. I think we're running up on our time here. Oh, here's another question. Forgive me if you've already answered this. As what phase of the process do you suggest AV integrators come onto a project? Oh, this is a great question.
I think it's a great question, and different answers probably to that. So we typically, like our firm is exclusively a design firm. So where we focus our attention is on the visioning and working in the early stages of the project along with exhibit designers, architects, and helping to kind of evolve that AV design in tandem with the exhibits and the architecture. And then there's a time though, I think when the integrator's expertise is really in pricing those projects and and knowing what are the best ways to deliver that project, and we find that there's a lot of value in kind of dovetailing those two services sometime during the construction documents phase to provide a seamless handoff, and in that way it leverages both firms' expertise and just helps to ensure continuity between the design and the installation.
That's good. And from a procurement standpoint, and you got to thank you for that from Lauren Aronson. So thank you. From a procurement standpoint, I know as an owner's rep, we're always kind of trying to look at that, and I agree. You kind of have to weigh where you are in the process, what's happening with the schedule, how far along the design is. And I think there are a lot of opportunities, and I always appreciate having integrators input, even if it's just very preliminary. I think that's, if you can find a way to bring an expert in early on, that's an interesting one. If you have clients who are demanding a bid process, and then you have to think about the procurement there and the best way to involve people that wouldn't preclude them from bidding on the project too. Here's another question. All right, I'll give you guys another one, and I've got this many times from clients. So when you are looking at pricing for, I think especially display, and clients look at that and they're like, "Holy cow, that's 10 times what it cost me to go down to Best Buy." Like, and then the answer we always get back is like, "Well, that's a commercial grade. It's going to last a lot longer." Do you guys really subscribe to that the stuff you can get at Best Buy, which seems to be, good technology for those of us who have TVs in our living rooms, for monitors, is it worth the extra money?
A good question, and I think it depends. There are times when maybe that's sufficient. I would say one of the biggest challenges is that typically those consumer grade displays don't flow through commercial channels in getting to you. So, and that impacts as far like the warranty and support. So oftentimes we'll specify the entire AV system as a package of parts, a kit of parts. And the AV integrator then is installing that as a turnkey kit of parts. And they're taking responsibility for delivering that for the overall functionality of that system. The integrators are not, the way the channels work, they're not set up to go buy consumer products at Best Buy. So typically when that happens, you're not realizing the same warranty, or you're purchasing a display as an owner and handing it to the integrator and asking them to install it, and then you've got blurred accountability and things like that. So while there maybe are some apparent upfront savings, our opinion is that the total cost of ownership doesn't necessarily provide the value by going after that cheaper upfront cost.
That's a really good answer. I subscribe to that too. And like you said, you're buying a system. So if there's a vendor that has a full system and a warranty.
And honestly, in the museum space, this is really an issue because a lot of the consumer displays can't be oriented maybe in portrait style. They're not always intended to be on 24/7. Some of the interfaces that they have for controlling them, like via control system or show control, either they don't have them at all or they're much more limited. So there are definitely some more limitations that maybe aren't apparent at first glance.
That's great. And a related question, since we have a couple minutes left here, thinking about the transition from a build to operating, right, in a museum environment, that's always a tricky thing, I think, with museum projects, right? And are there things from your perspective that clients and owners can do, museum developers and planners, to try and make sure that those vendors are going to be there to support the long-term operation? I mean, how would you best advise a client to make sure that when they hire somebody to do the build, that they're going to be there to support the system down the road?
Sure. I think it's important to start those. That's why we would not be necessarily an advocate on low bid always is the right option. And I think particularly in the museum space where you want to have, a deep relationship with your AV technology partner, it's important to choose that partner based on other factors like, chemistry and their support and their history and maybe their proximity to your project and things like that, because those are really important. Because if you don't have a really robust technical support staff, you need to rely on those firms to help you after occupancy, and they want to do that. But a lot of times the best firms at doing that post install aren't always the ones that give you the lowest price either. So I think it's important to kind of just look at the big picture and figure out which firm brings you the best value over the lifespan of the project.
Right. And even out of town vendors can sometimes work if they have a local installer that they've teamed with, and they can do that, because some things can be addressed and fixed or adjusted remotely, right?
Absolutely.
That's great. Looks like we had one more question here. Look at this. We're going to use the whole hour. Now it's a challenge. Okay, your take on super directional speakers such as audio spotlight, etc. This is similar to a previous question, I think.
Bryan, you want to take that?
Sure. Very useful for the application. The speak they work pretty well. They actually, you can actually beam audio to a certain location. but it creates a very small experience for maybe 1 or 2 people. And the dynamic range is limited. So you don't have a lot of low end, you don't have a lot of high end. So as long as your content is spoken word and you're trying to get the sound to one, maybe a second person, it's a good option.
That's fantastic. All right. Well, I'm going to give you guys the last word if you like. Otherwise, I think we can say goodbye and thank everyone again for your participation today.
Sure. Well, thank you, everyone. Really, it's truly our pleasure being able to share this hour with you. Hopefully, you all got at least one or a few tidbits that you didn't have when you came here. And you know, these are exciting systems. We love it. That's why we're in this field. And you know, hopefully, we gave you some stuff to think about. And if we can be of any assistance to you as well, we're certainly happy to do so and be happy to answer any questions that you might have after this today. So, thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. I know we're all busy, but if you spent an hour with us today, we definitely appreciate it.